I took hold of his right wrist and moved his hand behind his back. "You're under arrest," I said as I reached for his left wrist. Evidently, there had been a communication error. You see, he didn't want to be arrested. He pulled away from me violently and started to run. I reached up with my left hand and grabbed his shirt. He spun around on me and took a swing. It caught me on the shoulder, but I didn't really feel it. "Now what?" my brain was shouting. Let's see. Step back with the right foot, bring the left arm up and make connection with the subject's forearm. With my right hand, grab the subject by the right wrist, slide the forearm to the subject's upper arm, step away from the subject, drawing the arm out and creating an arm bar. Bullshit. My brain was trying to remember the exact steps to do an armbar takedown, the maneuver that had been taught to me in the police academy, but hadn't been trained or reinforced since then. What does your brain and body do when faced with a dangerous situation and adrenaline gets involved? You do what you spent most of the time doing in training, and when the department has failed to give you the foundation needed to succeed, you rely on anything that will work. I don't think he expected the headbutt. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. A couple of weeks ago, I caught a trailer for an upcoming documentary called Wrist Lock: The Martial Arts Influence on Police Use of Force. The trailer immediately caught my attention. Some of the big names in law enforcement training and martial arts were discussing the importance of physical control tactics training, physical fitness, and mental fitness in law enforcement. I reached out to the filmmaker Jason Harney and asked if he'd be willing to talk to me about his upcoming documentary, and he was generous enough to share some of his time with me. Jason is a retired sergeant from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and a documentary filmmaker. His first feature-length documentary was released in September 2017 and is titled The Basketball Family. It follows retired NBA player and former Purdue University standout Doug Lee and his transition from professional basketball to coaching. Jason has gone on to make several more documentaries: The Wounded Blue, Repeat Offender, Voices of Blue, a 6-part docuseries, The Making of a Cheer Team, and, coming in September, Wrist Lock. Jason, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's glad to be here with you, Steve. I mean, it's a great opportunity, and love spreading this message that we're trying to put out with this latest film and speaking directly to our police audience.
Yeah, I'm really excited about what's coming up. But before we get too far into that, I want to find out a little bit more about you, and specifically, how did you get into policing?
Well, I'm sure not unlike many, I have a family full of law enforcement. And my father, he's a retired Nevada Highway Patrol lieutenant, was on the force there for 32 years. Though I didn't join that agency, I ended up joining our local police department in here in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. Yeah, he certainly influenced me and sent me along that road of being a part of the law enforcement family.
So from Las Vegas Metro to documentary filmmaker, how does that happen?
Well, everybody has their story, right? And for me, I guess you could say I was one of those people, if you knew me, throughout my career, that really loved movies, and certainly it was always going to be my dream to someday make them. Now, I started, at the very minimum age, becoming a police officer, so I knew that retirement for me 25 years later was still going to leave me a fairly young man, and I'd need a second career. So I started to prepare for that early on. And we had a video production unit at Metro that happened to work in the same building I did during one of my assignments working as a training and counseling officer for our police academy. And what I ended up starting to do is spend a lot of my off time and weekends just being a second hand for them, learning everything that I could. And that was taking place in the late 90s. And by the early 2000s, I began to do video production work part-time, always with the idea that when I retired in 2015, that I would then go into full-time filmmaking.
That's really smart, preparing for retirement early on. It's often what I tell officers is they need to start planning for the future a little bit. And that probably explains why you seem to do a lot of work with foundations such as Wounded Blue.
Well, sure. And a good friend of mine, Randy Sutton, whose career paralleled with mine, give or take a couple years, is the person who started the Wounded Blue organization to help injured and disabled police officers nationally. And back around I'd say 17, maybe 2018, he had known I had just completed my first documentary film. It was a film called The Basketball Family, following a local high school team and their former retired NBA player coach. And once he had found out I had done something like that already, he was interested in producing a documentary film that would tell the 6 stories that inspired him to create his organization. And that film, of course, came out in 2019 and is also called The Wounded Blue.
How does working with those foundations and those types of series like that, how does that compare to making a feature documentary?
Well, that is what we did. The Wounded Blue is a feature documentary film. So, essentially what I'm doing as the filmmaker is creating and telling a story that is about their organization and how it came to be, which generally, as the story would go, is at the time, Randy was doing a radio show. His Facebook was often, the setting for a lot of messages from police officers all around the country, talking about how their departments did not treat them very well in the aftermath of critical incidents. We know that there are significant mental health issues in law enforcement, some of which can lead all the way to suicide. And that was something that Randy wanted to become a part of the solution. And so that is why he created his organization. And at the time it was being created, I was documenting the entire thing, and we traveled around the country telling these stories of cops. As an example, Anne Marie Carrizales in 2013, she was shot in the face and in the chest during a car stop on Graveyard. She happened to stop a group of gang members who had just got done robbing a series of convenience stores. She didn't know that when she stopped them. It was just a traffic stop to her, but then guns were drawn. She was shot. She actually got in her car and chased the vehicle for 10 or 15 minutes until ultimately they were caught later on. Unfortunately, as she will tell you, the physical injuries, that's the easy part to heal from. The mental injuries, that's where the challenges are, because now you're talking about dealing with your family at home, how the department perceives you, and coming back from something like that mentally is incredibly difficult for a lot of police officers. And that's where the Wounded Blue came in, and she was one of the prime stories we told in that film.
And Voices of Blue is something that I kind of binge watched yesterday, and wow, that's pretty powerful stuff there. And because it talks specifically about those emotional problems, those mental issues that come from those physical issues. And the thing that kept hitting me pretty hard through that is, why do agencies abandon these survivors?
That's a really good question. I think that if you were going to give a very generalized answer, you would say that about 85% of all 18,000 police departments in this country have 50 officers or less. That translates into them just simply not having the infrastructure in place and the procedures and the money to be able to look after police officers in the aftermath of a critical incident. And it really does come down to it being that simple. There is no peer support team. There is nobody looking after an officer. Sometimes they might be in the hospital, and sure, the chief or the sheriff and some of the higher ups will come say hi because they feel obligated. But then after that, everybody else goes on with their lives. The members of their squad will go on with their lives, doing their jobs, and they kind of forget about the guy who's at home healing from a gunshot wound or healing from the traumas of a traffic accident or even mental traumas. That's where some of the problems lie. And we did Voices of the Blue as kind of a sequel to the Wounded Blue film, because we wanted to show that there are so many other stories out there of officers who are suffering alone.
I think this leads in well. It's one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up to where we're headed to with your new documentary, Wristlock. You started with the Basketball Family, and I won't hold it against you that you featured a Purdue player, but that's okay. The Basketball Family, though, as you talked about being about that professional player transitioning to coaching, and then you go on to do the film, I'm sorry, I just spaced it, about the cheerleading. Both sports. And it seems like sports and law enforcement have been passions of yours, and Wristlock kind of brings both those together, looking at the combative sports of martial arts and law enforcement and how that all fits together.
Yeah, for sure. And along the way, actually, my film that I did, I did it before the Wounded Blue, but it came out after the Wounded Blue. It was called Repeat Offender, and that was kind of my foray into true crime. was based on a true crime book written by a detective here in Las Vegas named Brad Nickel. And he worked for the repeat offender program known as ROPE, and tracked career criminals for 15 years of his career. And the book was about his biggest case, which was about a guy named Damon Monroe, who is known as the most prolific commercial burglar and thief in Las Vegas history. And that was a great experience making that film. And you're right. Obviously, let me just say that when you make these films, they're incredibly difficult in terms of workload and the time committed. I mean, each one from start to finish is a minimum of a year, sometimes more, depending on how long the distribution process is. So you're right on in saying that if you see Jason Harney make a movie, then you can pretty much be guaranteed there's some level of passion toward that topic.
And I absolutely see that. There's some of I haven't seen all of your work yet, and I was trying to chase some of them down, but the stuff I have seen, it very much carries over. It has that kind of news approach, but a very straight approach. But underneath that lies that passion. You can tell you very much care about the topics you're filming.
Yeah, for sure. And, that is really what documentary filmmaking is. It's long form journalism. So, in comparing it to the news, really what I tell people in reference to a lot of these topics, particularly as it relates to these police subjects that we're covering, it's people like me who are trying to tell these stories that the mainstream media would never tell, because they're not going to get the clicks. They're not going to have the sexy topic that is going to sell ads for their business. And that's just the sad truth of it. So whereas, you could see the topic of a police officer who perhaps has used excessive force in a 3 or 4 second clip is going to sell millions of ads. But a police officer, even in the same clip, who was hurt and sent to the hospital as a result of that confrontation, gets nothing because the mainstream media doesn't care. But I do.
I so want to come back to that, and we're going to circle back around to that because I think that's really important to discuss. But before I get too far down that road, I really want to know about Wristlock. How did that come about? How did you end up making that?
Well, just like a lot of these projects, they're kind of long gestating. As I had told you, I spent a lot of time during my career as a defensive tactics instructor and taught at all of the various different levels from the academy through in service and instructor trainer. It was a passion of mine, to put it simply. And I always thought it was really important and always encouraged my peers, my supervisors, and everybody in between that the importance of proficiency in tactics should be at the top of their list for the multitude of reasons that we already know. If you are not well trained in a certain technique, it's not going to be available for you on the street when you need it at that moment of truth. Now, going back early into my career in the early 90s, a guy that I was assigned with on Graveyard, Southwest Patrol, was an officer named John Gentile. John is the main subject of Wristlock. Him and I have now known each other for, going on 30 years. And he was once my martial arts instructor outside of the police department. He is what I call the quintessential master martial artist. He is a guy who not only had a police career, but ensured that through his martial arts career and training outside of the department, he trained with all of the legends in the martial arts world. He's an instructor under Dan Inosanto, who many people know as one of the preeminent Filipino martial arts experts in the world, who's 80 plus years old today, among many other major names. And so, John ended his police career a couple years after mine. I just, brought him to lunch one day and said, hey, I have an idea. Let's make a documentary film about how the martial arts has influenced police use of force and defensive tactics in policing.
I think immediately when people hear that, particularly non-law enforcement, they're like, oh my gosh, we're bringing in martial arts now. This is over the top. It's unnecessary. But really having that skill and being trained in those gives the officers options and confidence to deal with problems as they come up.
Yeah, and I think that if people would take a look at the historical perspective of all of this, the fact is every technique that is taught in law enforcement is derived from the martial arts. And as a result of that, you kind of start to make a few comparisons between martial artists and police officers. martial artists are known to have certain attributes, right? They're dedicated to their craft. They have discipline. They're typically physically fit. They practice. That type of thing is important to them so that their skill level is always of the highest aptitude. Whereas police officers typically have none of those traits. And in some cases, as we know, police agencies will train their cops in defensive tactics in a police academy, and then they will never receive that training in any type of recertification training in their career ever again. And even good departments that I would say would get the gold star in training, such as the one I worked for, you're still talking about a very minimal level of hours of training each year. And then there's the idea is how many cops have the discipline and the dedication to not only take advantage of that training, but continue to practice because they know it's important. And that's really what this film is about.
And I remember as a young officer, I boxed a little bit when I was younger. I very much enjoyed boxing as a sport and from fitness standpoint. And when I got into the police academy, we spent a week with those physical control tactics and defensive tactics and pressure point controls, and a week to do that. And then when I get out on my own and I'm out working, when I have to use force of some kind, I punch somebody in the face. And that makes the bosses mad. They're like, you can't do that. And I said, well, give me a tool to use because you can't expect me in a week to learn how to do this stuff.
Well, that's just the thing. It's a career long process, and the rewards for that. I love one of the quotes in the film. It's in the film trailer. I assume you watched right at the end, where John himself states that he is less likely to use force when his skill level is at a level where he is confident in the force that he is using. Okay, meaning, of course, that people who have that confidence level in their training, and it doesn't matter what we're talking about, it could be defensive tactics, it could be really any area or subject in the spectrum of police training, you're going to be more confident in your job if you have the training and the practice to back it up. And any police trainer will tell you that.
From an educational theory background, we know that the repetition theory of learning excels when you deal with physical skills. And that's the idea that you have to do it over and over and over again to become proficient in that. We don't do that. Why do police departments not train these physical skills on a regular basis?
Again, that's a really great question. And the answer, we all know what it is. It comes down to money, time, and resources in terms of people. It's more important to a first line supervisor and a police administrator to ensure that there's the number of cops on the street on every shift that there needs to be versus having them, inside once a week training on life saving skills. And until we get to a point where administrators and more so the communities themselves understand that police officers are not the superheroes you think they are. They can't kick everybody's ass. They're not all physically fit. And that tool belt that they have is only as good as the training that they have with those tools, which in most cases is non existent. Even things like handcuffing are tactics that are completely ignored by most agencies after the police academy. And that is a huge problem. It's a tremendous liability. But the question being, why don't they? That's what I would say too. Why? I'd love to hear a police leader explain why. And if they're only going to use the argument about money, budget, funding, and manpower, that's their job to figure out a way around that, because this is just too important.
I was speaking to an academy class just a couple of weeks ago, and I found myself having to tell these recruits in an academy class that if they rely upon their police department to provide them with all the training they need to be successful in this job, they're going to fail, that they need to go out on their own and get this extra training.
Yeah, that is in your imperfect world, isn't it? Where you have police officers that aren't getting what they need at work from the place that is supposed to be training them, if for no other reason, for liability purposes. And then they're expected to go out to, say, their own martial arts gym, a martial arts gym somewhere in their community, and get this training on their own. The only problem with that, and you know this, is the standardization of training and use of force policy. The odds are that a lot of what they're going to learn at a martial arts gym probably is not going to be in line with what the use of force policies are and what techniques they are and are not allowed to use. So there lies the problem. That's the imperfect world. In the perfect world, these police agencies would supply this training to the officers because they know and believe it's important.
And I think what a lot of people misunderstand across the United States is that larger agencies aren't doing this either. I mean, obviously, the 2 and 3 man department is going to really struggle to provide this kind of training to their people. I was with about a 100 man department, and we did a pretty decent job with training. Although, when it came to the physical control tactics, we definitely didn't do that nearly as often. But you being with Las Vegas Metro, you guys still struggled with getting these done in a regular manner, didn't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, we had a couple things going for us. There were a lot of innovative leaders in our agency that saw the importance in some of the training that we're talking about. It never reached the level that certainly I had hoped. It did at times, but let's just say somebody like me is in an assignment that has influence over that, but then we move around a lot. Every few years, you go to a different assignment, somebody else replaces you and has a completely different philosophy. Then a lot of what you did will suddenly come to an end in favor of something else. And that's just the political world of policing, behind the scenes that we live in. We had advanced officer skills training, which was a once a year training that did include some defensive tactics and a lot of really good reality based, scenario based training with simunitions that officers were required to go through on their birth month. In addition to that, squads were typically afforded a 4 hour training day, which a half a day, 4 hours of training at the squad level every other week in what was known as your training day. The problem is, if any special event was going on during that time, let's say a presidential visit or something needed manpower in another area command, well, then guess what happened to your training day? It didn't happen.
And you don't have any special events in Las Vegas, so you don't have to worry about that.
Right, right. So I mean that was an issue, and again, those training days are only going to be as good as the supervisor that is running them and ensuring that that training actually is occurring at a high level and is quality training. We talk about one of the guys in our film, Marcus Barton, talks about that, where really the idea is let's just go have lunch and brunch. As a squad and just have someone sign the defensive tactics proficiency test off and just say we did it. Unfortunately, even in large agencies, that's very common. Whereas if you had me as a supervisor or John Gentile as a supervisor, you're going to get an authentic training course for that 4 hours, and every minute will be used, and you'll remember that training.
And that's the biggest problem I'm running into today as a trainer. You find that too many agencies just want to check a box and they don't really want to provide the necessary training. You actually, when you put together Wristlock, you've got a lot of law enforcement trainers on here, but you also have a lot of martial artists too. You've got some big names here. Tony Blauer and some of these guys have been around for a long time. Was it hard to wrangle all them and get them into the documentary?
Well, you know what? I had my dream cast, and I can tell you that fortunately for this film, nobody told me no. Everybody thought it was a really great and worthwhile project. We're very gracious to give John and I their time. John, as you'll see in the film, unfortunately for him, gets to be the stunt man, as he likes to say, with all of these various talented individuals. But for the cast, generally what we were looking for was somebody that was either that was a retired police officer, preferably a police trainer during their tenure, but also a high-level martial artist. So if you kind of look at the key art on the top, that's that group. And then the bottom is more or less a group of experts that, like Tony Blauer, has spent the last 4 decades innovating and training police officers in self-defense.
You don't stop with just the martial arts within the self-defense. It looks like you're going to dive into physical fitness and those issues as well in this film.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, here's the bottom line in my eyes. If you take your average use of force encounter, there are three factors that are going to be needed in order to have a successful outcome in that scenario. That would be your defensive tactics proficiency, physical fitness, and your mental health. If any one of those three factors were missing in that scenario, you can see where there would be some issue. In other words, you could be really good at your defensive tactics, but if you are going to have a heart attack after you run for 10 seconds, that's a problem. If your mental health is left unchecked, then and you are in an emotionally charged use of force situation, the tendency for you to over or underreact is always going to be there. And I certainly believe that a lot of the incidents that we have that have caused national outrage, especially over these last few years, can be attributed to poor tactics, a lack of physical fitness, and unchecked mental health. And that's really the cornerstone of what the film is looking to put out there to a mainstream audience.
Blue Canary is here to help you tell your stories, and I couldn't do that without the help of some very generous sponsors. Let's take a quick break to hear from one.
The Legal Liability Risk Management Institute is the nation's largest provider of liability and risk management services in the United States. Our goal is to help reduce liability, reduce lawsuits, and enhance officer performance. Regardless of the size of your agency, we have a risk management solution. You may contact us at www.llrmi.com or call 317-386-8325.
Terrible hours and the stress and bad food, all of that makes maintaining good physical fitness a real struggle for officers.
Yeah, it really does, and it's kind of there are two factors involved in that, as you can imagine, and this would be applicable to really anything we're talking about, defensive tactics included. It's kind of a two-way street, right? In one sense, you have a police officer who is not keeping their physical fitness at a level that it needs to be. Now, what level does it need to be? In my mind, so that you can thrive and have the most healthful life possible during your career and after your career. I mean, really, that should be the goal, right? Is to retire and live a long life and not have all of the horrible things that we have to deal with as police officers, especially from a physical standpoint, uh, have you die young. So in the film, Wristlock, we interviewed a cardiologist named Dr. Jonathan Scheinberg. He's out of Austin, Texas, and he specializes in treating first responders as a cardiologist, and he himself is also a reserve lieutenant for the Austin Police Department. So he understands the job obviously and knows exactly what a cop is dealing with during a long career. And he in the film talks about some just harrowing and startling statistics that I really hope will ring true when people watch this, where they'll really start to understand that it doesn't just happen to other people, it can happen to you too.
Oh, I know my own personal journey in law enforcement. I had gotten terribly out of shape, was not feeling well, and from an emotional standpoint, not feeling well emotionally. I managed to make a change in that. I got a lot more physically fit. I started watching my diet a lot better. Started getting involved in regular class-led physical fitness exercising, and saw some dramatic changes. And I just felt so much better. And not just from a physical standpoint, but from a mental and emotional standpoint as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I really do think that your fitness level and your diet are going to be tremendous influences on your police career in ways that you really wouldn't know unless you lived by those principles. But here's the other side of the coin too, and here's a good question. Most, if not all, police agencies, upon hiring you as a police officer, are going to test you with a physical fitness test, and you're going to likely have to pass that test sometime in the last day of the police academy. So the question is, why is it that once you graduate the academy in nearly every police agency in this country, you never have to jump through that hoop again?
Right. Once you're on, you're on. And after that, you can have terrible fitness. You can have terrible eating habits. And again, it goes back to, in my opinion, the department not supporting the necessary training and foundations to keep their officers and make their officers successful, because they don't seem to care.
Yeah, Mike Bland, one of the guys in the film, he just actually retired from Las Vegas Metro Police, and he was in one of the top training positions in the department, and he's also Brazilian Jiu Jitsu black belt. And we did a screening of Wristlock for the Undercover Officers Association here in Las Vegas at the beginning of August, and one of the things that had come up with this was this physical fitness issue as it relates to training. And he made a great point, and he talks about it in the film too, and that is that when you are going to training as an officer, and I don't care what it's for, it could be for report writing, for criminal law, defensive tactics, and anything in between, that training is not for you. It's for the department. so that they can record the fact they gave it to you for later. It's just a liability shield for the agency. That's what training is today. It's not to make you a better police officer. It's just so they can say they gave it to you. And that's the sad reality of police training today. What is the most cost effective way to just get the job done so that your name can appear in a training database somewhere and we can say, when you screw up, well, we trained him in this and he used this technique instead.
I've talked many times on my shows about police reform and how I'm a fan of police reform, but we need to be reforming the right things. Training, making sure that the officers are receiving the proper training. And exactly, it sounds like and this is why I was so excited when I saw Wristlock and saw that first trailer, and I really wanted to talk with you. It sounds like that's exactly the type of thing that this documentary is going to be covering, being able to give those people information, insight, and maybe even some talking points back to their agency about what they should be doing.
No doubt about it. And I know that those are buzzwords that we're hearing a lot right now in reference to police reform. The way we put it in the film is just a slightly different word, and that would be a change of culture. In my opinion, and you take the physical fitness issue as an example of this. You have over 800,000 police officers in this country, and they're all basically A personalities, and they're going to be set in their ways, and they all think they're doing their job the right way. And certainly don't want to be questioned on anything, much less their fitness level. So here's what you do. You just say, July 1st of 2023, every single police officer that is hired in this country will, from that point on, have to take a physical fitness test, the same one they passed in the academy, every year during their police career, with gender, age standards applied to that. What will you have as a result? Well, give it about 20 years and about 80% or so of all the police officers in this country will now have been taking that test, and they'll know no different because it's their culture. It's not a change for them. Whereas you're asking the incumbent cops to do the same thing, I think you know what the answer to that would be. Not to mention the unions would fight it tooth and nail.
Absolutely. But I don't think it's a big step, because when I got into law enforcement, back in the late 80s and early 90s, eating the fast foods and all the terrible diets and everything was pretty common. As I was leaving my career and retiring after 30 years, I noticed a lot of these younger officers, they were bringing in their own foods. They were eating much healthier meals, and they were really trying to stay much healthier than we did in the past. So I don't think it's a huge step from a culture change, but I do think that you have to get some power behind that, whether it be the agencies or maybe even some mandates to make that happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do think that you have a lot of younger cops coming up who have a better mindset when it comes to these issues versus, the ones, our peers that we worked around, for you in the 80s and me in the 90s and 2000s, it would be like pulling teeth to, try to enact some of these things we're talking about. But, that's really what I'm hoping a film like Wristlock can do. Not so much for the police officers, but for the mainstream, because I believe if the mainstream begins to understand what police officers really are and where the weaknesses are and how they can be addressed, I think they are going to be better armed as a community to speak to the police leaders and say, this is what we expect. Because here's what I get all the time when it comes to Wristlock, and the people that have seen it, they're like, this should be viewed by every police academy. And I'll tell them, you know what? I don't disagree with you, but here's the problem. There's not going to be a single police administrator that would put this film on in front of their police academy. The reason why is because any smart police recruit in the room at the end of the film is going to raise their hand and say, are we doing any of this? And of course, the answer is going to be no.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, is that I think we have to change the culture from the bottom up. Trying to change it from the top down is not going to happen. Getting this out there and getting the rank and file to see it on their own will help them start making some of those steps to do the things that I think we need to do to really make a change in our profession.
No doubt about it. And it's going to take a lot of small steps. I mean, again, when you have 18,000 police agencies and they're all doing the same job, but they're all doing it just a little bit differently, and they all believe they're doing it the best and that they're the best. A lot of ego involved in the police training world, in the police administration world. And that's where, I look at this film as something that the core audience is not cops. I feel like it can benefit police officers, no question about that, if they're willing to listen and listen to the people on screen. who are going to give them very good information that they can likely apply to their own careers. But the reality is, we need the mainstream to understand police. We have no PR in this profession. We have a mainstream media that has made it their business to vilify police officers in general, and every negative thing that comes about. That's what you see plastered up on those news channels, not positive stories and the good things they're doing. So until that changes, we have got to do our best to get this type of information out there to the public so that they begin to understand what it's really like to be a police officer and what the challenges really are.
And lets me circle back around to what you said earlier, that you started making documentary films wanting to tell the stories that the media wouldn't. We recognize that from a documentary film standpoint, the filmmaker's biases can really get into there. What kind of struggles do you have as a documentary filmmaker with that, and having maybe a different look than some of your traditional documentary filmmakers?
For me, I think one of the keys is allowing the subjects in the film to tell the story. That's really what I try to strive for. It's not so much my story to tell as much it is theirs. Just like your podcast here, a documentary film is giving people a platform to speak about an issue, which in this case, is the martial arts influence on police use of force and police training in general.
So when are we going to get to watch this thing? I'm dying to see it.
Okay, well, I actually just earlier this week confirmed our release date. It is going to be September 20th, and it will be on VOD, available for rent and purchase on Amazon, Apple TV, Google Play, and Microsoft Xbox to start, and then about another probably 30 or so platforms worldwide starting October 4th. And those will be announced as soon as I get them. But they'll be on all the cable on-demand services like DirecTV, Dish, and then eventually on all of the ad-based VOD platforms as well down the road. So September 20th is the date.
I just did a podcast on my what I consider the 5 best cop movies. What would you say is your favorite or best cop movie?
I would have to go with Heat.
A big Heat fan, are you? Okay.
I am, yeah. I liked Heat for a lot of different reasons, but primarily because of the epic nature and a lot of the accuracy they went into. The 24-hour job, the dedication that directly affects your family, because you're working when the criminals are, right? You've got Al Pacino's out there meeting with CIs at 2 a.m, and who's he leaving at home? Wife,
right,
and daughter, and speaks about how he's on his 3rd marriage already. That kind of thing. So I think a lot of the reality of that. And then one of the other things too that came about in the 1997, I covered it in Voices of the Blue, the shootout in North Hollywood. If you think about it, that showed the public for real just what Heat was trying to do in a fictional realm. And that is that, police officers need to have the playing field evened out a little bit when it comes to the firepower that they have at their disposal, where, you saw 4 men with automatic weapons, M16s, in Heat, and they're able to take on an entire police force who are just armed with shotguns and handguns. And people don't typically understand that, a shoulder weapon with automatic fire is going to be able to hold down a lot of people that are just firing back with handguns. And I don't think people really understood that until that film came out. And I really applauded Michael Mann, the director, and the realism that he injected into that.
Well, you're not going to get any argument with me about Heat. That is a fantastic film. Is there any last thing you want to say to the listeners about what you're trying to do, what you've been doing, or maybe something they can take with them from this?
Well, I really do hope that when Wristlock comes out on September 20th, that people will take a look at it. And I'm very accessible on Twitter and LinkedIn. Can easily be contacted, and would certainly be happy to, have a conversation about the film and talk about these issues. I feel like they're really, really important. And as I stated earlier, it's crucial that a police officer take his proficiency in defensive tactics, physical fitness, and mental health seriously. Otherwise, I don't really see how we can effectively do our jobs moving forward in this world, in this ever-evolving, divisive society that we're living in right now, I think it's even more crucial than it ever has been that police officers are at the top of their game.
Jason, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate it. And I can tell you that I'm going to be one of the first ones in line to watch that as soon as it becomes available on September 20th. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.